In the spring of 1889, in a played-out silver camp called Ardith Springs, high in the Sawatch country of central Colorado, a young woman paid $11 for a building that no one in the county wanted, and the men who sold it to her laughed all the way back down the mountain. The building was the old stone jailhouse at the edge of the dead town, and it had stood sealed for 19 years. Not locked, sealed. Every door welded shut along its iron seams, every window barred and then filled with mortar from behind. And the strange thing, the thing the county clerk had warned her about while she counted her coins onto his desk, was that the welding had been done from the inside. A man had closed himself into that stone box and joined the iron so that no one could open it. And then, somehow, he had never come out. The county had given up trying to learn why. Clara had not. She was 28 years old that spring, and she had come up the mountain with a mule, a canvas roll of tools, and almost nothing else. Her father had been a blacksmith and a farrier in a river town 300 miles east, a man named Josiah Vane, who could read a weld the way other men read a printed page, and who had died of a lung sickness 2 winters before, leaving his daughter the trade he had spent his life teaching her, and very little besides. The forge had gone to his creditors. The house had gone with it. What Clara kept was the knowledge in her hands and a wooden chest of his tools, and when she heard, in a boarding house in Leadville, that a sealed jailhouse in a ghost camp was being sold for back taxes, she had felt something turn over in her chest that she did not yet have a name for. Stay with me, because what she found behind that iron was not what the county expected, and not what she expected either. The men at the tax sale had treated the lot as a joke. There were 3 of them, speculators down from Denver who had come for the timber rights and the mine tailings, men in good coats with city boots that had never broken ground. And when the clerk read out the old jailhouse and its 1/4 acre of frozen ground, one of them had called out that he would not give $1 for a tomb he could not open. The others had laughed. The room was a low office at the county seat with a stove that smoked and a window gone gray with frost, and the men were warming their hands and waiting for the lots they had come for. And the jailhouse to them was a thing to make a joke over, while the clerk shuffled his papers. Clara had stood at the back in her father's wool coat, which was too large for her and which she had not taken in, because taking it in would have meant it was hers and not his, and she was not ready for that. When the bidding opened and died in the same breath, she had raised her hand and said $11 in a voice that did not shake, and the clerk had looked at her for a long moment over the top of his spectacles before he brought down his hand. One of the Denver men turned in his chair to see who had bought it. When he saw a woman, he smiled the way men smile at a child who has said something unintentionally clever, and he told her she had bought herself a great deal of stone and no way in, and that if she ever did get in, she would likely wish she had not. Clara folded her receipt along its crease and put it in the inner pocket of the coat and did not answer him. Her father had taught her that a closed thing is only a problem, and a problem has a shape, and a shape can be worked. She had $11 less to her name than she had owned that morning, and a deed to a sealed building in a dead town, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt the particular steadiness that came over her only when there was real work ahead. The road to Ardith Springs climbed for half a day through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen not yet in leaf, and the camp, when she reached it, was a street of leaning gray buildings with the roofs fallen in and the sky showing through the rafters. Snow still lay in the shadows where the sun did not reach, dirty and crusted, melting nowhere. A magpie watched her from a broken gable and then dropped down the back of it and was gone. The street had a name once, painted on a board that now lay face down in the mud, and she did not turn it over. Doors hung on single hinges and swung when the wind came through, and the wind came through often, down off the high snowfields above the town, carrying the smell of cold stone and old timber. The jailhouse stood apart at the upper end of the street, set back against a shoulder of granite, and it was built more solidly than anything else in the town. 2 rooms of squared stone with a slate roof that it held, and an iron door at the front that someone had turned into a single welded plate. She stood before it in the thin, cold light and read the iron the way her father had taught her, and what the iron told her stopped her where she stood. The welds were good. They were better than good. They were the work of a hand that had laid down each bead with the slow, even rhythm a master keeps. No skips, no cold laps, no place where the heat had run away from him. The whole seam as true as a line drawn with a straight edge. Whoever had laid that bead had been a master of the craft, patient and sure. And a man does not seal himself inside a stone room with the work of a master, unless he has a reason that matters more to him than the air he will breathe. She made her camp in the shell of the old assay office across the street, where a corner of the roof still kept the weather off, and she picketed the mule on the dead grass and unrolled her tools by the last of the daylight. She did not sleep much that first night. She lay listening to the wind come down off the high country and move through the empty town, and she thought about the man inside the stone. And she thought about her father, and the 2 thoughts braided together until she could not tell them apart. Her father had taught her that iron remembers. He used to say it standing at the forge with a bar going from cherry to straw in the coals, that every heat a piece of iron had ever taken stayed in its grain, and a smith who paid attention could read a weld and know the hand that made it, whether it was rushed or careful, whether the man was angry or at peace. He had taught her to lay a weld that would outlast the men who doubted she could lay it at all. He had taught her that the work does not care who is doing it, that the fire and the iron answer the hand that knows them and no other, and that this was the only fairness she would ever be able to count on. When the creditors had come for the forge, one of them had said it was a pity, a girl with all that learning and nowhere to use it. Clara had said nothing then either. She had simply taken the chest of tools and gone west to find a use. Across 19 years, the county had assembled only the bones of the story, and Clara learned them from the one man in the valley who would still talk about it. His name was Eli Tarrant, an old prospector who had a cabin 2 miles below the dead camp, and who came up on the second morning to see what the smoke from her fire meant. He was past 70, bent and slow, with a white beard stained yellow at the lip, and eyes that had not lost their sharpness. He looked at the welded door for a while, before he looked at her. Then he told her that the man inside was named Henry Coldwell, and that Coldwell had been the town blacksmith in the years when Ardith Springs was alive, and that the night the camp emptied, Coldwell had gone into the jailhouse and closed the iron behind him and was never seen on the mountain again. Eli did not know why. No one had ever known why. What he knew was the shape of the trouble that had taken the town, and as Clara worked, he sat on a stone and told it to her in pieces over the days that followed. Ardith Springs had been a company camp, he said, owned in all but name by a man named Augustus Fry, who held the assay office, the company store, the bank that was not really a bank, and the deeds to most of the claims that the miners thought they owned. Fry had come up from Denver with money and a smooth voice, and he had a way of lending against a claim, and then, when the assay came back poor, calling the note and taking the ground. The assays always came back poor for the men Fray wanted gone, and rich for the men Fray wanted to keep. Eli had lost a claim that way himself. So had half the valley. By the winter of 1870, the good ore was said to be played out. The men were leaving, and Augustus Fray had ridden down the mountain a wealthy man with a strong box of deeds, having bought a whole district for the price of a few called notes. "What did Henry Colwell have to do with it?" Clara asked. Eli was quiet a while. "Coldwell had been Frey's man for a time," he said. "The blacksmith did the company's iron, shod the company's horses, made the strapping for the company's strongboxes. And then, in the last weeks before the camp died, Coldwell and Frey had fallen out over something no one ever learned, and Coldwell had taken to keeping his own counsel, and the night the town emptied he had sealed himself in the jail. Some said he had gone mad with the silver fever. Some said he was hiding from Frey's hired men. Eli did not believe either story. He had known Coldwell a little, and Coldwell had not been a man who went mad or a man who hid. He had been a man who finished things. Clara turned that over while she set up to work. A man who finished things. She looked at the welded door, at the master's bead laid down by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. And she began to think that Henry Coldwell had not sealed himself in to keep the world out. She began to think he had sealed something in to keep it safe and had paid for it with the only currency the moment allowed. She did not cut the door. That was the first thing she decided, and it surprised Eli, who had assumed she would take a torch or a cold chisel to the welded plate and force her way in at the obvious point. Clara explained it the way her father would have. A weld that good, she said, was laid by a man protecting what was behind it, and a man like that would have planned for someone coming at the door, because the door was where anyone would come. Whatever Coldwell wanted found would not be found by the front. So she walked the building instead. For 2 days she walked it and touched it and listened to it, running her palms over the squared stone, learning the grain of each face, where the chisel had dressed it true, and where the weather had worn it, tapping the mortar between the blocks with the back of a chisel, and listening to the note each joint gave back. Her father had taught her that a wall, like a weld, is honest if you know how to ask it. Soundstone gives a dull, full note, a note with no air in it. Stone with a void behind it sings, a higher note with a hollow at its heart, and a person who has spent a life among worked things learns to hear the difference the way another learns to hear a false coin ring on a counter. She went over the front wall and heard nothing but full stone. She went over the 2 side walls and heard the same. She left the rear wall for last because it sat hard against the granite shoulder of the mountain and seemed the least likely place a man would trouble to hide a door. On the 3rd day, low on the rear wall where the granite shoulder of the mountain came down close behind the building, she found a course of blocks that sang. She knelt in the cold shadow there for a long time, with her hand flat against the singing stone, and she thought about how a man would do it. He would not leave a door anyone could see. He would build a way in that looked like wall, mortared from the inside so that the seam faced away from the world, and he would trust that only a person patient enough to listen to a whole building would ever find it. Clara had been listening to buildings and iron and the honesty of work things her whole life. She set her tools out on a square of canvas, her father's tools, the cold chisels graded by size, the 4-pound hammer with the handle worn to the shape of his grip, and then to the shape of hers, and she began to take the mortar out of the singing course, joint by joint, in the failing light and the next morning's light, and the light of the day after that. The work was slow and it punished her hands. The mortar Coldwell had mixed was hard as the stone it held, harder in places, a lime he had burned and slaked himself and packed into the joints when it was still hot. And she could win only an inch at a time, setting the chisel, reading the grain of the old lime, turning the edge to follow the seam instead of fighting it. Her father's voice came to her as she worked, not as a haunting but as a habit, telling her to let the tool do what the tool was made to do, to stop forcing and start listening. that a chisel driven straight into hard lime will skip and bruise the stone and teach you nothing, but a chisel laid along the seam at the angle the seam wants will part it clean. She found the angle on the first joint and kept it. Her palms blistered and the blisters broke, and the broken skin wept and stuck to the chisel handle, and she wrapped her hands in strips torn from her spare shirt and went on. And when the cold stiffened her fingers past use, she warmed them at the small fire and went on again. Eli came each day and watched and sometimes held a block as she worked it loose, steadying the weight so it would not drop and crack. And he did not offer to take the chisel from her, which she noted and was grateful for, because it meant he had understood without being told that this was hers to do. She marked her progress not in feet but in joints. 4 the first day, 6 the second, and on the evening of the second day of cutting, the first full block came free in her hands, a squared stone the length of her forearm and heavy as a sleeping child, and behind it was not the rubble fill. The rest of the wall was packed with. Behind it was a smooth-dressed face, dressed by a chisel as careful as her own, and a current of air came out of the dark gap, cold and still and old, air that had been shut away from the living world for 19 years, and it smelled of iron and dust, and something faintly sweet that she could not name, and did not, in that first moment, want to. She did not reach in. She sat back on her heels and let the air move past her, and she felt the years in it, and she understood that she was the first living person to breathe what was on the other side of that stone since the night the town died. There are moments when a long labor turns into something else, when the body's work opens onto a thing the mind was not ready for. And this was one. The gap was no wider than her hand. There was a night's more work to open it enough to pass a lantern, and another day's to open it enough to pass herself. She did all of it. She did not hurry. Henry Coldwell had not hurried, and she would not insult his work by tearing at the last of it. What was inside, when at last she brought a lantern through the gap she had made and held it up in the close stone dark, was a room exactly as a man had left it 19 years before. The lantern light moved across it slowly as she turned, and it found the things one at a time. A narrow cot against one wall, the blanket folded square at its foot, the corners true, the work of a man who kept order even at the end, a bench with a row of files laid out by size, and a small portable forge, cold these 19 years, the coal still in its scuttle, and a half-finished piece still in the vise where he had left it, a tin cup and a tin plate, washed and set to dry on a shelf where they had dried into the dust, because a man does not stop being orderly merely because he has decided to die. The air was dry and dead and held no rot, only the long cold and the dust of years lying soft and unbroken on every surface, so that the room had the stillness of a thing held under glass. And against the far wall, where the lantern light reached it last, a strong box of black iron the size of a steamer trunk, banded and strapped and fitted with a lock the like of which Clara had never seen. A lock that was not a lock at all in the ordinary sense, but a welded puzzle. The keyhole sealed over with a bead of iron, the whole face of it joined shut by the same master hand that had sealed the door. And there was Henry Coldwell. He sat on the floor with his back against the strong box he had spent his last strength protecting, and the dry, cold air of the sealed room had kept him as the years found him. And Clara took off her father's hat and stood a while in the lantern light and did not speak, because there was nothing to say to the dead that the living have any right to say aloud. She saw the welding rod still in his hand. She saw that he had sealed the strong box last, after he had sealed the door, working in the failing air until the air gave out, and that he had laid down his final bead with the same patience as his first, because the work does not care. And a master does not stop being a master because he is dying. You may want to look away here. Clara did not. She had come up the mountain to learn why a man would weld himself into the dark, and the answer was sitting in front of her with his back against it, and she owed it to him to look. It took her 4 days to open the strongbox, and she opened it the way Coldwell had meant it to be opened, which was by a smith. The welded keyhole was a message. Her father had taught her that a weld laid to be broken is laid differently from a weld laid to hold, that a man who means a seam to be cut someday by the right hand will leave that hand a grain to follow, a line where the metal wants to part. Coldwell had left such a line. Clara found it on the 2nd day, running her fingernail over the cold bead in the lantern light, again and again, eyes closed, reading the iron the way she read everything, by touch and by patience, until she felt the faint ridge where he had backed off his heat on purpose. The one place along the seam where the master had made his work a hair weaker than he could have, deliberately, as a man leaves a door unlocked for the one person he is waiting for. She understood then that he had not sealed the box against everyone. He had sealed it against the wrong hands and left it open able by the right ones, by anyone who knew iron the way he had known it. And she felt across 19 years and the silence of the grave a kind of recognition pass between them, smith to smith, that was steadier and surer than grief. She cut the seam he had left her to cut. She drew the lid back on its banded hinges, and inside the black iron strongbox, wrapped in oilcloth against the years, was the truth that Henry Coldwell had died to keep. There were ledgers, 3 of them, bound in leather, and they were the true assay records of Ardith Springs, kept in Coldwell's own careful hand, because Coldwell, it turned out, had done more for Augustus Frey than the shoe his horses. He had built the assay furnace, and he had learned, slowly and then all at once, how Frey was using it. The ledgers set it down plainly. Beside each official assay that Frey had filed with the county, the poor numbers that had let him call a note and take a claim, Coldwell had recorded the true assay, the real silver content of the ore, the numbers Frey had buried. Claim by claim, man by man, the 2 columns ran down the pages, the lie and the truth side by side, and the gap between them was a map of everything Augustus Frey had stolen. Eli Tarrant's claim was there. The true assay would have made Eli a man of comfortable means. Frey's filed assay had made him a pauper who lived out his years in a cabin below a dead town. There was more. Beneath the ledgers lay a packet of the original claim deeds, the real ones, the ones Frey had replaced with forgeries when he recorded his takings at the county seat. Coldwell had gotten hold of them somehow in those last weeks, and that, Clara understood at last, was what the falling out had been about. The blacksmith had stopped being the company's man. He had gathered the proof of the company's theft, the true ledgers and the true deeds, and Frey had learned of it, and Frey had sent men. And Henry Coldwell, knowing he could not carry the proof down a mountain watched by hired guns, knowing he was one man against many, and that the roads were closed to him, had done the only thing a man who finished things could do. He had sealed the proof in iron in the one building in town that was built to keep men in, and he had sealed himself in with it, and he had trusted that the iron would hold longer than Frey's lie, and that someday a hand that could read it would come up the mountain and let the truth out. It had taken 19 years. The hand was hers. She brought the ledgers out into the daylight, and she sat on the stone step of the old assay office and read them through while Eli sat beside her. And when she came to his claim and the 2 numbers beside it, she turned the book so he could see, and she put her finger under the true assay and did not say anything, because some things a man should be allowed to read for himself. Eli looked at it a long time. His hands were shaking when he took the book from her, and not from age. He had spent 19 years being told he had simply chosen poor ground, that the mountain had not favored him, that his poverty was the ordinary verdict of luck. The book in his hand said otherwise. The book said he had been robbed, precisely and deliberately, by a man who had filed a lie with the county and walked away rich. There is a particular grief in learning that a hard life was not bad luck, but a theft, and Clara watched the old man meet it, and she did not look away from that either. Augustus Frey was still alive. That was the thing Eli told her when he could speak again. Frey was an old man now, living in a tall house in Denver with his name on a bank and a wing of a hospital and a pew at the front of a church. A respected man, a man whose money had long since washed itself clean in the way that old money does. He had outlived nearly everyone he had robbed. He had certainly outlived any fear of being called to account for a silver camp that no living person but Eli even remembered. And Clara, sitting on the cold step with the proof of his thefts in her lap, understood that she held in her hands the power to undo a man who believed himself entirely safe, and that she could do it without raising her voice, without a confrontation, without ever standing in the same room as him. The ledgers would do it. The deeds would do it. The truth, laid out in 2 columns in a dead man's careful hand, would do what no accusation could. She thought a great deal in the days that followed about what Henry Coldwell would have wanted done. He had not sealed the box to make himself rich. He had been dying when he closed it and had taken nothing for himself. He had not sealed it for revenge. A man bent on revenge does not entomb his proof for the chance that a stranger might someday free it. He had sealed it for restitution. He had wanted the record set right and the stolen ground returned to the men it had been taken from, or to their children, and he had been willing to spend his life to give the truth a chance to outlast the lie. Clara decided that she would finish what he had started, the way he had finished what he could, and that she would do it through the law and the record, and not through any door that could be slammed. It was not quick. Restitution rarely is. She copied the ledgers by hand, every line, so that there would be more than one truth in the world if the original were ever lost. She took the deeds and the books down the mountain to the county seat, and she laid them before a clerk, and then before a judge, an old circuit judge named Halloran, who had been a young man in the silver years and remembered Ardith Springs, and who turned the pages of Coldwell's ledgers with a growing stillness on his face. The forged deeds in the county's own records were compared against the originals from the strongbox, and the forgeries, once anyone knew to look, were plain. The 2 columns of assay numbers, the filed lie, and the recorded truth, told the rest. It was the kind of evidence that does not argue. It simply sits on the table and is true, and the men who built their comfort on its absence have nothing to set against it. Augustus Fry was never brought up the mountain and never met in any room by Clara, or by Eli, or by anyone they knew. That was not how it ended, and Clara had never wanted it to be. What happened was quieter and heavier than that. The county reopened the old claims. The forged deeds were struck from the record, and the true ones entered in their place. Word of the ledgers traveled, as such things do, down to Denver, and into the tall house with the clean money. And the respected old man found that the foundation he had stood on for 19 years was not stone, but paper, and that the paper had been countersigned by a dead blacksmith whose hand could not be bought or frightened or sent away. Frey's name came off some of the things it had been on. The lawyers came. The slow machinery of restitution, once started, did not need Clara to push it, and she did not push it. She had laid the truth on the table. The truth did the rest, and Augustus Fry spent what was left of his life watching it work, which Clara thought, when she thought of it at all, was a fuller justice than any she could have delivered with her own hands. Eli Tarrant got his claim back. He was too old to work it, and he knew it, and he laughed when the judge's letter came and said as much. The law now said the ground was his, and that it had always been his, and that the man who said otherwise had lied. And Eli told Clara that he had not understood, until the letter came, how much of the weight he carried had been the not being believed. He sold the claim to a young family come up from the valley, and the price was fair, the true price, the price the true assay said the ground was worth. And Eli lived his last years in his cabin below the dead town, as a man of comfortable means, and more than that, as a man the record had finally called honest. There were others. Clara found them, or their children, one by one, working from the names in Coldwell's ledgers. It took her better than 2 years, and she spent most of what little she had doing it, traveling to the towns the dispersed miners had scattered to, riding the mule down out of the high country and taking the slow trains east and south. A canvas roll of her father's tools always behind her saddle, because a smith can find a day's work in any town, and she often had to. She laid the true assays before sons and daughters who had grown up poor on the strength of a lie filed in a county office before they were born. In a railroad town on the plains, she found the widow of a man named Pruitt, who had died still apologizing to his family for the poor ground he had staked, and Clara showed the woman the 2 columns beside Pruitt's claim, and watched her understand that her husband had not failed them, that he had been robbed, and that his shame had been a thing planted in him by another man's lie. The widow did not thank her at first. She sat with the book a long while, and then she asked in a low voice whether her husband could be told, and Clara understood she meant at his grave, and she said that he could, and that the record would say it for him now in a place that could not be unsaid. She did not enrich herself. She took nothing from the claims or the restitutions but the cost of her travel. And when people asked her why, she found she could not explain it in a way that satisfied them, and she stopped trying. The truth was that she was finishing a dead man's work because the work deserved finishing, and because her father had taught her that the worth of a thing made well does not depend on who is watching or who gets paid. And those 2 teachings, the Smiths and the Smiths, had turned out to be the same teaching. Have you ever learned that something you took for your own bad luck was, in fact, a thing that was done to you? Clara saw that knowledge break across more than one face in those 2 years, and she came to think it was the truest gift the strongbox held, truer even than the silver. And if it stirs something in you, you might sit with it a moment before the story closes. She buried Henry Coldwell in the spring of the 2nd year, on the granite shoulder above the jailhouse, where the morning sun reached first. Eli helped her, and so did the young family from the valley, and the circuit judge sent a letter that was read over the grave, and it named Coldwell what the record now said he was, which was an honest man who had died, keeping a truth that other men had tried to bury. Clara set no grand stone. She set a plate of iron, squared and dressed, with his name and his years worked into it by her own hand at the small forge she had brought up the mountain, and she laid the letters of his name down in a weld so clean it would outlast the granite, because that was the language he had spoken, and she meant the marker to speak it back to him. She did not leave Ardith Springs after that, though she had meant to. The jailhouse, once it was open, was only a stone room again, and she cleaned it out and mended the slate roof and made it sound, and she set up Coldwell's small forge beside her father's tools and began to take work, the iron of the valley, hinges and shoes and strapping, and the 100 small repairs a country of working people always needs. The young family had spread the word that there was a smith up at the old camp, a woman, and that her work would outlast the men who doubted she could lay it. Some came up the mountain just to see if it was true. They went back down believing it. Eli died in his 4th winter back in his own ground, an old man in a warm cabin called Honest. Clara closed his eyes and saw him buried beside the trail he had walked up so many mornings to watch her work, and she missed him with the plain, steady grief she had learned from her father, the kind that does not weep, but does not forget. After that, she was alone on the mountain again, but it was a different kind of alone than the one she had carried up it. She had come up with a chest of tools and a question, and almost nothing else. She had the tools still, the strong box she kept. She moved it into the jailhouse and set it against the wall where Coldwell had died, and she did not lock it because there was nothing left in it to protect, the ledgers and the deeds having gone out into the world to do their slow work. Yet she kept it, and on the evenings when the day's iron was cold and the mule was fed and the light came level down the dead street, she would sometimes sit on the floor with her back against it, the way he had, and look at the door she had not cut, the welded plate at the front of the building, which she had left exactly as he made it. She had found her way in through the wall, and she had left the master's bead at the door untouched, because some work is too good to undo, and because it told, to anyone who came and could read it, the whole story without a single word. What she had paid $11 for, the men down the mountain had called a tomb that could not be opened. They had been wrong about all of it. It had been opened by the one hand the dead man had trusted would someday come. It had not been a tomb, but a strong box built around a truth, and the truth had been let out, and the wrong it recorded had been made right, claim by claim and name by name, in the slow grave fairness of the record. And the woman who had done it sat in the evenings with her back against cold iron and her father's hammer within reach of her hand, in a town the world had given up on, beside a door she would never open, and she was, in every way that the work could make her, at peace. The iron remembered. It had remembered the master who laid it and the truth he sealed behind it, and it had waited, the way iron will, for a hand that knew how to ask. That hand had come up the mountain for $11 and a question, and it had asked and the iron had answered, and what it gave back was not silver but something a great deal harder to steal. If this story moved you, you might tell me in a few words about a truth you watched come to light long after the people who buried it thought it was safely gone. And if you would like another like it, there is one waiting about a woman who bought a sunken riverboat for the salvage and found in its strong room a manifest that a shipping company had spent 40 years pretending had burned.